All right, caller, you're live on the air. Please tell us your name, where you're calling from.
Hi, this is Michael Purdue from Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Looks like you got in, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
very good. Go ahead with the question.
Rabbi Singer, I have a question. Uh, I've recently received Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical, and I love it. It's a great book. Um, and I understand why Christians would want to reject the oral Torah. But my question specifically, I've heard that the Kaarite Jews reject the oral Torah on scriptural means. And I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that. Why do they do that, perhaps?
That's great. Yeah,
Uh, all
Michael,
right.
thank you for the question. If you want to go ahead and hang up now, you can tune in for the answer. Okay.
Great. Thank y'all so much.
Hey, thank you too.
Shalom.
Take
Bye.
care. Bye bye. Okay, guys, phone line's closed. This will be our final topic for the day. Rabbi, take it away.
All right. So, as it turns out, today there are a lot of website Karaites, but there are the Karaites. So, this is a heresy of Judaism that started in the 8th century. And like every big fight started out as a political fight. And the character that emerges that ultimately triggered, like Carrots are gonna hate me for saying this. They don't like it. But there was a institution called the Reish Galusa. The Reish Galusa means the head. It literally means the head of the exile. Rosh Galusa. Although it's an Aramaic construct, and essentially who was the leader of the Babylonian Jewish community, and the Babylonian Jewish community was the leading Jewish community in the world. I don't want to go through the history of it, but when the Jews were exiled to Bavel, great institutions were established there by prophets. And those institutions continued for well over 1,000 years, actually, to not that long ago. And the Reish Galusa, I'm just summing this all up for you, had an enormous amount of power. And at that time, because in Bavel was under the control of the Islamic Caliphate, the Islamic Caliphate had input of who was going to be designated as leader of the Jewish community, and it very often was, not always, but it was, uh, family and so on, and it was handed down to family, because the person who's the Reish Galusa also was from the house of David. Now, what happens? What I laugh because it's a tragedy, and I don't want to cry on air. What happens when the person who thinks he's in line to be the exilarch, which means the head of the head of this very prestigious institution. What happens if he doesn't get the job and someone else is chosen instead? Well, what happens is war. From your, I think you said you're from Baton Rouge or wherever you said you're from. You're an American. I could tell from your accent. So the bloodiest war that America fought was not Vietnam. We lost almost 60,000 kids. Bloody, nothing. World War II, whatever, 500,000. But the Civil War, maybe a million Americans died in the Civil War. In 19th century, and in the 19th century, it wasn't so simple to kill a million people. There's no war like a family fight. Okay, as I'm trying to convey to you, and you see that all over the place. A family fight, forget about it. Now, if you don't get the job And someone else gets this very procedure. The person who were very interested is a man named Anan ben David. Although David wasn't really his father's name, but because they were from the Davidic house, that was the name assigned. He doesn't get the job. He doesn't get the job. So it's, well, then a pox on all of you. And he splinters away. And now, what would you do if you're going to say, the hell with you? And what would you do? Like, what kind of revenge would you take? So think about this, because you want to smell this. So what you would do is you would then say that the whole institution is no good. You would just do a scorched earth approach where you just burn the whole thing down and say that the rabbinic authority, which was certainly in the hands of the exilarch of the Reish Galusa, I mean, there's tremendous authority who these sages were. And there were many, 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 many great, great, great sages. So what would you burn down to the ground? So Anan was not he wasn't an atheist, to say there was no God. See, but what you would say is that the whole movement of great sages who would pass down often from father to son and would be moved down represents the shalshelet, the chain that where the Torah was handed down with all the oral tradition was handed down from generation to generation. We see in Tanakh that oral Torah is passed down. You won't know where to look for it if you're not completely conversant in Tanakh, but it's all over the place where the oral Torah is all over. So what you would do is you would then say, if I can't be the lead, I'm going to rephrase this, but this is what happened. If I can't be the lead rabbi, then there aren't going to be rabbis. Or if I can't be the lead rabbi, then rabbis have no authority. And this was so bitter. It was so personal that it was war. This was civil war. And that's where the Kaarite movement emerged. It emerged in Babylon. And it grew. Today, there are Kaarite Jews. There are. It's not many. A lot of people who are Kaarite Jews today who are on Facebook, social media, their parents weren't Karaites, but the idea that the rabbis are all corrupt and there's no alternative could be attractive. So people often will be drawn to it because they just don't like the institution of rabbis, but they don't really realize the enormity of what they're saying. Because without an oral Torah, you would not have performed the commandments. So much so, listen to this. This will blow your mind out the way. Your frontal lobe will shoot into your spleen. So in practice, Karaites were not atheists. They just said there's no oral Torah. But there's a big problem. If a Christian says we don't believe in the oral Torah, Christians don't keep written Torah. You don't keep written Torah, you don't say how preposterous that is. So the Karaites had to literally come up with their own oral Torah, which very often mimicked what the regular Jews believed. They call us rabbinate Jews because it's like the Christians saying, oh, rabbinic Judaism, and it's meant derisively. It's not as a compliment. So, but in order to keep the Torah is so vague. The Torah tells us you should wear tefillin, the totafos. It's a word never used anywhere in Tanakh. Like, what is it? What are you supposed to bind on your head? You would never know what that is unless you had an oral information of precisely what that was. And in case anybody is wondering, they found 24 phylacteries in the caves of Qumran. And they're on display for the whole world to see in the Israel Museum in the Shrine of the Book. Anyone want to, you can go to the Shrine of the Book and you can see one of the 24 phylacteries. And those phylacteries are precisely according to the laws that we use today. Exact same thing. That's 2,200 years ago. You understand? So the Karaite movement essentially emerged, and it's very attractive to say that the rabbis it's a conspiracy, and the rabbis are just taking upon themselves authority for which they don't have, especially if you were expelled or you were not given the authority you craved. Now, there are many scholars that trace the Karaite movement to the Sadducees, the Tzaddukim, which basically disappeared after the destruction of the Second Temple. Why? Not important. It basically faded away after the temple was destroyed. But that element of it is certainly in common. And it also began with a personal vendetta. So if you think it through, if you're not given the job, then a pox on all of you, then there is no such job. And I'm going to oppose the institution for which I was supposed to get the job for. Got it? And that is how the Karaites began. Now, they developed a whole apologetics of why. But I have volumes on this. I discussed this, and I have a very large chapter on this in volume 1, Let's Get Biblical, and audio programs and many, many lectures on this topic. And I said, the Karaites had to, you wouldn't believe it if you didn't study the topic. If you study it, there's no lack of literature on this. They had to develop their own customs, own traditions to fill in the gaps because the Torah doesn't say what to do, how to do it. So they had to develop their own tradition. They just assigned those traditions not to it comes from Moses, but it comes from their reasoned inference that their early scholars had, and then they transmitted it. So they had to essentially mimic the real thing in a system that rejects that these traditions come from Moses, recognizing that you can't perform it unless you have some explanation for what these things are. I have just offended a lot of Karaites, but what can I do? I can't hide this under the carpet. And I have a lot of Karaites who are, I don't know, they're followers of mine. They won't like this, and they really don't like that this comes from Anan ben David. They don't like that because they. But here's and I'll end with this. I mean, this is what you think in your mind. So where in Jewish literature prior to the 8th century do people self-identify as Karaites? Nowhere. So it begins. So Anan ben David lived essentially from like I think he was born in 715, 714. He died right at the end of the 8th century. I think he died in 795. So there's nothing prior to him where people are calling themselves Karaites or anything like that. So you have to think this is just another way of looking at it. If, in fact, the truth was that there's no oral Torah, and the rabbis just made it all up, and even though, again, it's all over Tanakh, just people don't know where to look for it. But we'll set that aside. Then why do the Karaites come later? It should have been if Rabbinic Judaism, meaning Pharisaic Orthodox Judaism, was a later iteration, a later man-made invention. You should have Karaite Judaism from the get-go. And then in the 8th century, some guy decided he wanted to make up stuff that it came from Moses. It should have been the reverse. Then why did we come first? That's it. Today, the fight is largely over, except on the internet. Today, there are Karaite communities. They're in Israel. They're in the coastal cities. There's an ancient Karaite synagogue in Jerusalem in the old city, but it's largely a museum today. I don't think it's not used in regular services and so on. If you're watching this and you're a Kaarite, please don't be offended. You know that whenever I'm asked to prove something, I'm asked to prove it. I prove from the written Torah because Christians don't believe in the oral Torah. Why? Because someone told them not to. But anyways, soon this whole it's not a real dispute because there was a time when the Karaites were huge in Babylon and other areas and in Turkey. There were very big communities. They're not anymore. There are some, very little. There was once a big Karaite community in Egypt. Jews, gone. Now, did they move to Eretz Yisrael? They did, but today it's all withering away. And that's the story, my friends. Anan ben David, and it always starts with something political, and then it explodes into personal and religious and customs. Well, there's your answer. Thank you so much for that phone call. William?
Yes,
You
sir.
did good this time.
Thank you. Good show, Rabbi. Very good. It's always good with you here, no doubt about it.